Have your friends ever invited you to a whiskey tasting and you have no idea what you're doing? Well, I'm here to help. My name is Angie and I'm the beverage director at the Urban Stillhouse by Horse Solider. We do whiskey tastings here all the time and I'll walk you through all the steps. Before we get into tasting bourbon, let's talk about what makes bourbon bourbon. So there are a few rules that bourbon has to abide by in order to be legally considered bourbon. The first being that bourbon has to be 51% corn minimum. It has to be aged in new American charred oak containers. Now notice I didn't say barrels because it doesn't have to be a barrel, it just needs to be a container. However, barrel is the preferred method as that's easiest to transport and make sure that there's a watertight seal. The next big question is, where can bourbon be made? Most people assume it's only Kentucky. However, as of May 4th, 1964, bourbon became the United States spirit, and it can be made in all 50 states. So the next part is going to get really nerdy, so we're going to go over proof of the whiskey. Bourbon must be distilled at 160 proof or less because you don't want to lose any flavor profile from the grains. Going into the barrel, it needs to be between 80 proof and 125 proof. You wouldn't want to go in at any less than 80 proof because if you did, you would lose proof in the barrel and then it technically wouldn't be bourbon anymore. And lastly, there are no minimum age statements for bourbon. Once it hits the barrel, it's bourbon. Now that we know what bourbon is, let's talk about how to properly taste it. The first step to tasting bourbon is to swirl it. What you're doing here is basically you just want to start by looking at it and observing it, almost like you're tasting wine. So similar to wine, when you swirl the glass, bourbon is going to have what they call legs. The more legs they have, typically the higher the proof because higher viscosity. You also want to notice the color of the bourbon. Typically, the darker the whiskey is in the glass, the longer it's spent in a barrel, meaning the older the whiskey is. The second step is going to be to nose the bourbon. So what you want to do is slowly bring it up to one nostril with your mouth open and smell and move it to the other side. It's important to keep your mouth open when you're nosing a whiskey. Otherwise, the major smell you're going to get is just going to be alcohol, and you're going to miss out on a lot of the other flavors and notes that are in the whiskey. Now we're going to get into the part where we're actually going to start tasting the whiskey. But first, you want to take a small sip to open up your palate. Basically, you want to take a small sip as if you're tasting coffee, but you don't know how hot it is. Now that your palate's open, you're probably thinking the first taste is just alcohol. But on your second taste going back in is where you're going to start to pick up on more of the flavors in the actual whiskey. So on your second sip, what you want to do is take a bigger sip this time and hold it in your mouth. And we do what we call the Kentucky chew, where essentially you're going to swish it around your mouth and physically chew the whiskey in order to coat your entire taste buds. The last step is to smack your lips at the end, which seems obnoxious, but it's actually going to help open up your palate further to get the finish on the whiskey. At the end of the day, the best way to taste whiskey is the way that you like. Now that we've gone over how to taste bourbon, please make a reservation to visit us here at the Urban Stillhouse to learn more about our Horse Solider spirits, or if you'd like to taste at home, purchase any of our bourbons at ABC Fine Wine & Spirits.